Good afternoon. It's good to have everyone back here to study the book of Acts. We are going to continue our journey with Paul and the rest of the group, starting with chapter 25, verse 13, going all the way to 26:11. So it'll be quite a journey we'll be on as we go forth with our study in the book of Acts. Paul has done the ultimate appeal, just kind of give you a recap, as any Roman citizen would be able to do, and has appealed to Caesar, which now puts the wheels in motion for his trip to Rome, which is somewhere where we know he wanted to go, as he eventually wanted to make his way to Spain, Rome being one of the stops along the way. It's fascinating that he's done this, and one reason is, well, there's a lot of things fascinating about Paul, but one thing about this is that just years before, probably based on where we are right now, I would say 8 to 10 years before, because we can't be extremely specific on dates, but 8 to 10 years before Claudius had kicked out all of the Jews, even Christian Jews, out of Rome. And so that was quite the deal. So you could think of it as similar to what happened to the Jewish people with the Holocaust during World War II. Some people have compared it to that. About 4 to 5 years later, Nero takes over, and this is before Nero does not like Christians. He still likes Christians at this point. He allows Jews and Christian Jews back into Rome, and so we're back at a time where Jews and Christian Jews are allowed back in Rome. But it's a very interesting and different issue for the Jews who had left, because the 4, 5, 6 years that they were away, the Christian Gentile churches had started going their own way, started doing their own thing. And we see that if you read the book of Romans, you see a lot of that. You see some of the issues they were trying to work out together when it came to when it came to different traditions and beliefs, when it came to food, when it came to food purity laws, when it came to many other Jewish traditions and laws that the Jewish Christians would follow, but not the Gentile Christians. And so a lot of stuff had happened since then. So it's just interesting to see, and to be able to really get the full picture of that, you do need to read the letter to Rome, called Romans. Going back to where we are right now, though, you have to remember that Felix did nothing with Paul, even though he determined Paul did nothing wrong. And then Festus, of course, shows up, and Paul gets passed over to Festus. Felix, for the most part, washes his hands of Paul. He has now been sent away. He had apparently caused some sort of issue or uprising among the Jewish people, which caused kind of some bloodletting, and was asked to return to Rome. Unfortunately, his brother, if you remember from last week, helped him from getting the ultimate penalty there in Rome, and kind of helped him along because of his brother's money and influence. I'd encourage you to go back to next week when we're going through that part of that to see more details about what happened to Felix. So Festus comes along, and he comes to the same conclusion. The thing with Festus, though, is that he does not really know the Jewish traditions and the Jewish laws as well as Felix did. He had not lived within that world very long, and was not as, of course, would not be as familiar with that. And I think the hope of the Sanhedrin and the high priest was that, well, this Festus guy, he doesn't really know how this all works, so maybe we could take advantage of him that way. And that doesn't work for them either. So anyways, it doesn't work for Festus. And then we get to meet, during this part, what we talk about today, King Agrippa, who's part of the Herod family, and his sister Bernice show up. Sometimes when you read about Agrippa II and Bernice, people think that's husband and wife. And, in a very controversial way, they could have been, based on some of the eyebrows that were raised during that time of who the two were, but they were brother and sister. So that's where we are today. We're in chapter 25, verses 13 through 22 is where we're going to start, and then we'll make our way from there. Chapter 25, verse 13, and I'm going to go ahead and just read all the way through. Through 22, and then we'll wrap up after that. Now, when several days had elapsed, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and paid their respects to Festus. While they were spending many days there, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, "There is a man who was left as a prisoner by Felix, and when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priest and the elders of the Jews brought charges against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him. I answered them, that is not the custom of the Romans to hand over any man before the accused meets his accusers face to face and has an opportunity to make his defense against the charges. There's kind of a little bit bent to the truth here. Anyways, so after they had assembled here, I did not delay, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought before me. When the accusers stood up, they began bringing charges against him, not of such crimes as I was expecting, but they simply had some points of disagreement with him about their own religion and about a dead man, Jesus, whom Paul asserted to be alive. So this verse 19 is very interesting. We'll get a little bit more details into it, but you have to think how odd this whole thing was for the Romans to hear there's a resurrected man who the sect, the Way, believed to be the God of the universe. He is now dead. He was resurrected. And so that to them is very strange. To most people back then, this story was very strange, which is why there's some controversy tied to it. Today, we've been hearing it for 2,000 years, so for most of us who are following along here, it's not a strange story. But back then, absolutely would have been a strange thing to hear. Verse 20, being at a loss how to investigate such matters, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and there stand trial on these matters. But when Paul appealed to be held in custody for the emperor's decision, I ordered him to be kept in custody until I sent him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I would also like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, he said, you shall hear him. Agrippa has absolutely no court. What's the best way to say it? He has no authority whatsoever in this matter. And we'll explain why that here in a second. But for him to want to see Paul is more of just a personal interest for Agrippa. And maybe to learn a little bit more about what Paul is talking about. But for the most part, he has no authority to do anything to Paul. No trial that he could put him on, at least nothing that would be formalized. So as we go back to verse 13 here, Festus is still, of course, in kind of a pickle, as when he sends Paul to Rome, he will have to have a letter accompanying Paul with him. You can't just send someone to the Supreme Court there in Rome and not have a letter of reasoning of why you sent this prisoner under extreme guard, because, when the Romans traveled with their prisoners, they had them very heavily guarded because they didn't want anything to happen to them, much like we saw back at Antonia Fortress, and we've seen in other places as well in Jerusalem. He could use records from what Felix wrote, most likely what Felix had written down or scribes had written down. There would be available to Festus. And he could also use the letter that Lysias provided to Felix back there in chapter 23. So those would all be available to Festus to be able to use. The problem for Festus is that even with all this information, he's even more confused than he had been. And he become quite perplexed because, of course, Paul's saying one thing, the priests are saying something else. The people who actually accused Paul of desecrating the temple didn't even show up. And Festus, again, is not very familiar with Jewish law, so he doesn't really even know what the big deal is. He's like, you're talking about some dead guy who resurrected and these guys follow. He doesn't really see why this is an issue for them. But fortunately, King Herod Agrippa II shows up, who is ruler for a client kingdom northeast of where Festus is there in Caesarea, and he was heading into town. And most likely, Agrippa was coming as some sort of, as a formality to welcome Festus and congratulate him on his new position. There's more to it than that, and we'll talk about that here in a second, but it would be typical for someone like Agrippa to come down and talk to a Roman governor. Agrippa was a Jewish king, which was typical for Rome to put into place, and they would work with Roman leadership as well as with the temple high priest to make sure peace was kept. The Romans wanted Jewish kings to rule over their regions, as it usually would keep the peace. It would help if you had someone over you who you had some sort of relationship with or some sort of connection with. It typically would go better for everyone. At least that was the hope of the Romans. The unfortunate side of this equation of what they were dealing with is that the Herod family was not great at leading, and they had all kinds of issues and problems and incestual dealings. And if you go back to chapter 12, and you remember Agrippa the First had caused some problems and then met a very swift and horrible end, and it just continued from there to Agrippa II as well as some other Herods along the way. The reason Festus and Felix before him were even there in the first place is because the Herod family could not lead or keep the peace in the area in which they were over. So the Romans had to send in their own governors to help kind of keep the peace because of the incompetence of the Herod family. With that said, because of this, it was good for Agrippa II at this point to get on the good side of the Roman governor. So when a new Roman governor would show up, or procuriate would show up, it was something that Agrippa or whoever was the Jewish king at the time would want to absolutely go and meet them and make their way into town as all kinds of pomp and circumstance. Agrippa really had no power, but it was one of those things where they could all kind of get along and work together. So, of course, Herod Agrippa, or Agrippa II, was known to be very well versed in Jewish tradition and law. So it was the hope of Festus that Agrippa could provide some guidance along the way. And I think we maybe get a little bit of that, but probably not as much as what Festus was hoping for. I want to provide a little more background on who Marcus Julius Agrippa was. That was his Roman citizen name, according to the coins that he had minted whenever he was made king over the province in which he was in charge of. So he's the son of Herod Agrippa, who died, the first Agrippa, he died in AD 44. And Claudius had planned to make Agrippa II the king, but he was only 17, so the land was put under the rule of Roman governors, so he wasn't old enough to rule over it, so they put some Roman governors, I think eventually hoping that Agrippa II would be able to start running it. In AD 50, Claudius gave Agrippa II the kingdom of Chalcis, which is now modern-day Lebanon, as well as the ability to appoint the Jewish high priest, which was relatively new, or it kind of went back and forth for the Jewish kings to be able to do that compared to typically, then other times Roman governors would be able to appoint the high priest. So at one time, I think it was AD 6 to AD 37, the Roman governors appointed the high priest. Agrippa I was given this responsibility in AD 41. When he died, the Roman governors tried to appoint again, and a guy by the name of Cuspius Fatus, who is the new procurator of Judea, wanted to be the high priest. So a Roman governor, a Roman procurator, wanted to be the high priest, which of course that would not go well, and no one would want that to happen, not even the Romans, especially not the Jews. And I think mainly, at least my understanding is, this guy, Cuspius Fatus, wanted to be it because he liked the vestments. He liked what the Jewish high priest wore, and of course he probably liked the power involved with that as well. So the Jews, of course, would protest this, and Claudius then allowed Agrippa II to appoint the next high priest. In AD 53, it always sounds like I say AD, like the number 80, but it's actually AD. Am I right? Yeah. Agrippa gave up his smaller kingdom for a larger that consisted of the tetrarchies of Philip and Lysias. And you have to go back to Alexander the Great to know what the tetrarchies were that he had founded after he had pretty much conquered the known world at the time. Nero then expanded or augmented the land that Agrippa had power over. He added Tiberias and Tarichaea. He threw in a few more villages and as a token of gratitude. Agrippa then changed the name of the capital from Caesarea Philippi to Neronius, which of course they like to do that for Nero. People like to name cities and towns after themselves. Agrippa played a large role in trying to prevent the revolt. In AD 66, the revolt I'm referring to is the one that eventually destroys the temple in Jerusalem in AD 70. He tried to but he failed miserably, but yet he remained faithful to Rome, much more faithful to Rome than he was to the Jews, and he was then rewarded even more territory in AD 75, and he was promoted to a praetorian. So what a deal for him. Now, what about his sister Bernice? She also played quite a role, and she actually tried to keep the peace too and try to keep the Romans from destroying the temple in Jerusalem. And so she performed a Nazirite vow in an attempt to prevent the massacre of the Jews by a guy by the name of Gessius, depends on, I guess you want to pronounce that with a hard or soft G, Florus. Her house was burnt down by the extremists, and the extremists at this point were the Jewish extremists, not by the Romans. She survived the war and moved in with her brother in AD 75 in the city of Rome. we'll talk a little bit more about Bernice here in a second. But anyways, back to the present story of where we are here. Agrippa was joined by his sister Julia Bernice, the eldest daughter of Agrippa I, and she was given in marriage by her father to his brother Herod, king of Chalcis, and it was very ordinary during that time for nieces to marry their uncles, or uncles to marry their nieces, however you want to say that, in the Herod family, and it could, as you can imagine, get quite messy and incestual. When her uncle died, who ended up being her husband, when he died, she moved in with her brother, Agrippa II. She later marries another king named Polemon, but left him and returned to her brother because they were not able to get along. Not a lot of detail that I'm going to provide today on that, but that did not work out well. She ultimately was a very controversial character based on her relationship with her brother. Like I said, some would say it was possibly incestual, which of course led to many of a gossip session around the local water well. She was fashionable and a powerful woman, so it'd be odd for her to meet with a minister such as Paul. So what this is pointing to, this whole conversation of Agrippa and then someone like Bernice meeting with Paul is very odd. It's a very, it wasn't something that people of her status would be meeting some itinerant preacher, crazy guy going through town talking about a new sect. So very interesting that they would even meet in the first place. That was a whole lot on that first verse. Trust me, the rest of them will go much faster as we go through this. When Agrippa and company, so these are verses 14 through 19. When Agrippa and a company were in Caesarea, Festus decided to bring up the subject of Paul. They weren't coming specifically to talk about Paul. They were coming to meet with Festus. Maybe they'd heard of what was going on with Paul, but it doesn't seem like that was their main goal of why they went, or main point of going there. He gives them the summary that we see here of the Sanhedrin and what Felix did, and the Jews wanted a conviction, but Felix did not, thus upsetting the Jews, mainly the high priest. And Felix understood the need for Roman justice for a Roman citizen, though the Jews did not want to really play along. The rules back then, as brutal as the Romans could be, they did believe in law, and they did believe in fair trials, and they did believe in fair trials specifically, especially for their own citizens, and had very strict laws related to that. And if you did, like we know with Lysias back earlier on, chapter 22, when he was about to flog Paul, and the terror that came upon him whenever he realized what he was about to do to a Roman citizen that had been unconvicted would have put him in deep, deep trouble. So the Romans were very, very aware of the law and would be very much keeping the law. Now, a little sidebar here. Of course, we have the Pax Romana, which is their own version of peace. And to be honest, some people would refer to it as their own gospel, the good news of Pax Romana, the good news of Roman peace. And they really is propaganda, and they really try to sell it. They're really trying to push it. You could just imagine if they had posters back then, if they had video screens and billboards, it would all be about Roman peace, much like something you'd see from something very dystopian, Hunger Games type of thing. So they did. Romans had their own sort of gospel going on there that they were trying to spread in order to keep the peace. And then, of course, Paul shows up with his own version of the good news, which is truly tied to the one and only God, which the Romans did not believe in. And so you can see there's some confusion, which is the requirement of all the epistles from Paul, especially the one to Rome. So as we remember now, Festus had allowed a similar trial to what Felix had done, but instead Festus faces even more surprise and perplexity, as all the accusations are centered around Jewish religion and tradition, and more specifically about this man Jesus who had been resurrected. To make it even more weird, of course, was that Jesus was dead, because back then people who died were not born or did not become resurrected. And to have this itinerant preacher to come through and say that he was alive through resurrection would leave Festus in quite a quandary. Throughout this entire time, Paul remains very centered and focused on the hope of the resurrection. He never deviates away from that, no matter who he's talking to. Now, he changes his story a little bit, not to be inconsistent, but he changes it depending on who his audience is, depending to be Jew or Gentile, to help them understand context. But he's always consistent when it comes to the hope of the resurrection. This resurrection has now become the key pivot point in the trial and discussions, but it seems to have been completely missed by Festus, and even you could say by Felix. We can assume that Agrippa knew enough about this sect, the way, that he would be able to have a good idea of what is going on. So he's familiar enough with the Jewish tradition to know that they believed in a resurrected Messiah and that would happen. Or not all of them, the Sadducees did it, but the Pharisees did. And it wouldn't be so alien and strange to him to hear this sort of story coming from Paul. Like I said, that would be much faster. Those verses 14 through 19. Verses 20 through 22, Festus continues to provide a summary of his idea that Paul got to Jerusalem, that Paul go to the Jerusalem for the trial. Remember, Festus wanted to send Paul back to the high priest there at the temple, and then he would, of course, oversee it because that was his job, and that would be he's required to be the official over any sort of proceeding like this. But of course, Paul doesn't fall for that, says no, and appeals to Caesar, which is the right of any Roman citizen, and he does that. Agrippa's interest at this point is piqued while Paul remains in Caesarea, awaiting his orders to go to Rome, and so he wants to know even more about what's going on from this interesting man named Paul. All right, verses 23 through 27. Turn to there. Paul comes before Agrippa. So on the next day, when Agrippa came together with Bernice amid great pomp and entered the auditorium, accompanied by the commanders and the prominent men of the city, at the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. I mean, if you've seen Hunger Games, this is probably what it looked like whenever they have those big celebrations with everyone showing up and the tributes standing before them. Festus said, King Agrippa, and all you gentlemen here present with us, you see this man about whom all the people of the Jews appealed to me, both in Jerusalem and here, loudly declaring that he ought not to live any longer. But I found out that he had committed nothing worthy of death, and since he himself appealed to the emperor, I decided to send him. Yet I have nothing definite about him to write, my lord. Therefore I have brought him before you, all and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after the investigation has taken place, I may have something to write. For it seems observed to me in sending a prisoner not to indicate also the charges against him. It's very odd here that a Roman governor would be talking this way to a Jewish king, because the Roman governor was truly the one actually with the power and the authority at this point. But the way he's speaking to Agrippa is as if Agrippa is the one of authority. And maybe he's, we know that he's inexperienced and young, and maybe he's even trying to figure out a way to appeal to Agrippa so he can get his information so he can go on and write the letter. So who knows his motivation, but it's not typical for a governor, I would say, based on what I've seen in the past, to speak to a Jewish king like this, just based on their levels of authority and who is more powerful than the other. So anyways, verses 23 through 27, Festus arranges a meeting for Paul to meet with Bernice and Agrippa, leading to a fun ceremonial pomp and circumstance. It's very exciting, very, very much pomp, very much circumstance, probably streamers and horns and loud singing, who knows. But it's not just an audience of Agrippa and his sister, but also with members of the procurator's staff and leading citizens of the city. Most likely everyone in there is, for the most part, Gentile, especially based on the leading citizens of the city. The tribunes on the procurator staff consisted of 5, as there were 5 auxiliary cohorts there in the Caesarea region. Festus would be in charge of this event, and Luke pokes a little bit of fun at this as he refers to it as a great ceremony, a festal procession. He's seeing this as more of kind of a something fun to watch, kind of a circus, maybe you could even look at it. He's not looking at this as something as a formal trial, which it's not, or anything of any sort of importance or significance, though it is to a point, but there's a little bit of fun that he's pointing at this. This is a big deal in some respects, and Luke is making it clear that someone like Paul is shown to be powerful and influential based on the audience that he has been brought before. This is proven to be true as we read in the epistles. Paul is, you could say that he's an itinerant preacher, which is what he was to a point, or itinerant apostle even. You could say that as he traveled from place to place. But he obviously had some sort of authority or some obvious significant influence that he would be able to garner such an audience like this to where they would be that interested to be able to hear what he has to say. At the end, it is Paul who is really leading the show, and history will prove this out. Final few verses there of chapter 25, verses 24 through 27. Paul's brought in, and Festus begins that he has no charge against Paul. There's nothing that he's learned that would make this man no capital charges, nothing of any sort of substance, or even an eyewitness. Eyewitnesses still haven't even showed up to say what Paul had done to the temple or any of the other charges that he's had placed against him. Obviously, Festus is at a loss of what to do with Paul or what to write about him, so he hands this over to his royal audience. This is in no sense, like I said, this is no sense a trial. It's an informal inquiry, as Agrippa has no authority to conduct any sort of trial in Judea. He may have, in the province in which he was over, have some sort of ability to do that, but for the most part, where he was right now, he absolutely did not. Also, since Paul had appealed to Caesar, there's nothing else he could do. I mean, even if Festus wanted to do a formal trial at this point, he couldn't, because the appeal to Caesar had already been made, or the appeal to the emperor had already been made. And so there's would not be any other trial until he had his day of court there in Rome. Ultimately, Festus was required to write a report, as we know, and he needed help, all the help he could get. So it would not be allowed, like I said, he could not just send a prisoner to Rome without a letter or without some sort of official document to accompany the prisoner, because the amount of, it just was unheard of. So there's no way he could have done that. All right. As we move forward here, we're going to go into chapter 26. And chapter 26, 1 through 11, is where we will begin. And we'll be able to see Paul's defense here before Agrippa as he gets going. And I'm going to go ahead and read 26, 1 through 11, so that we can have the full story. So chapter 26, verse 1 through 11. Agrippa said to Paul, "You're permitted to speak for yourself." Then Paul stretched out his hand and proceeded to make it his defense. "In regard to all the things of which I am accused by the Jews, I consider myself fortunate, King Agrippa, that I am about to make my defense before you today, especially because you are an expert in all customs and questions among the Jews. Therefore, I beg you to listen to me patiently. So then, all Jews know my manner of life from my youth up, which from the beginning was spent among my own nation and at Jerusalem." We've heard this story again before from Paul. Different audience, a little bit different take of how he's doing this. "Since they have known about me for a long time, if they are willing to testify that I lived as a Pharisee according to the strictest sect of our religion, and now I am standing trial for the hope of the promise made by God to our fathers, the promise to which our 12 tribes hope to attain as they earnestly serve God night and day, and for this hope of, O King, I am being accused by Jews. Why is it considered incredible among you people if God does raise the dead?" He's, of course, appealing specifically to Agrippa and then whatever Jews were there listening in. "So then I thought to myself that I had to do many things hostile to the name of Jesus of Nazareth, and this is just what I did in Jerusalem. Not only did I lock up many of the saints in prisons, having received authority from the chief priests, but also when they were being put to death, I cast my vote against them. And as I punished them once in all the synagogues, I tried to force them to blasphemy, and being furiously enraged at them, I kept pursuing them even to foreign cities." Okay, that's where we're going to stop with the scripture today, and we're going to run through this just a little bit more, and to see where we are, and then of course continue the rest of chapter 26 next week. So of course here back in chapter 26 verse 1, Paul accepts King Agrippa's invitation to speak. Paul is given the opportunity in a non-formal trial by Agrippa to speak in front of him and the rest of the community leaders. Paul provides a defense, but less about him, but more of an apologetic for the gospel. So you can think of an apologetic, of course, as a defense for the gospel. He's done his defense before. He's used different directions and different ways to communicate it, but he's always had a consistent message when it comes to his defense of the gospel. And what it says here is how he has and will continue to remain in conformity with the gospel. He has been very consistent since his little trip to Damascus, where Jesus, for the most part, changed his perspective on everything. This is a similar speech from chapter 22, where he spoke from the stairs of the Antonia fortress. We're not in San Antonio. When speaking to the crowd that wanted to kill him. As Paul is very good at doing, his tone and delivery is different based on his audience. This is a formal and dignified audience he is speaking to, so would refer to it as a apologia pro vita sua. So for those of you who know Latin, you know exactly what I'm talking about. For those of you who don't, well, can look that up. Through this, he is attempting to show he is not showing any hostility against the Jews. His grammar is much more formal and classical than he's had in his previous speeches. It seems he has framed it specifically for Agrippa, who seemed to be very interested in Jewish theology. Most likely, Festus was way out of his league in the first few sentences and really had no idea what was even being said, because he's not familiar with the Jewish traditions or laws. And so let's look at verses 2 and 3 here. Paul presents his exordium or introduction, does his introduction to his defense here. He is able to congratulate himself for just making it here, to be able to speak in front of someone as eminent as Agrippa, someone who is so well versed in Jewish religious belief and practice. He believes Agrippa would understand that Paul is continuing the faith of the Jewish religion, which is in fact what Paul is doing, even though there are many Jews who do not believe that's what he's doing. You could ultimately think of this as the consummation of Israel's ancestral faith. This is what is all pointing to. Since the beginning of the Israel belief, or the Israel's belief in a single God, their monotheistic viewpoints, their religion has all been pointing to this, to the resurrected Messiah. He did not promise to be brief like Tertullus did. If you remember back then, before Felix, and you typically say that before a leader that you're speaking to. But he did hope that what he was saying would be fully heard out by Agrippa. You just hear that in his tone. Paul talks about the resurrection and hope that he has that has been brought to all people through the Jewish Messiah. Paul provides a brief autobiography of his childhood and upbringing. This is something that all of his contemporaries would understand and were familiar with. Many of the audience would have known he was a Pharisee. They would know enough about him that he was a Pharisee, and Agrippa probably even had heard that as well at some point. And then, of course, Agrippa would be familiar of what Pharisees are and what they believed, mostly. As we know, Pharisees believe in the resurrection of the dead. So the crazy thing is that he is being persecuted and prosecuted by claiming the very thing that they claim to believe as Pharisees, as Jews. This is the hope that he's providing of all Jews since the beginning of the Jewish people. Like I said, this hope has been since the beginning of this group. And it's not like he's making up anything new, and he's trying to make that very clear multiple times as he has gone through this. This is the hope that God had promised the patriarchs. If you remember, the patriarchs from early on in Genesis, and all the Jews since, people pretty much starting from Abraham onwards, had been given this promise and this hope and this belief that of eventual Jewish Messiah, and it would give them a purpose. The reason they did their worship, the reason they had their ordinances, and the reason they had their traditions, that the 12 tribes had maintained over the generations, was all because of this idea of this messianic resurrection. Now, they didn't know the name of Jesus, but they knew there would be a Messiah, and they knew about the resurrection of the Messiah. It's amazing how they'd forget this or don't see it. Maybe their hearts have become hardened, or their eyes have been shut to the message, which you can't blame them because it's been over a significant amount of time. And to this day, we still have our hearts hardened to things that we should be believing or remembering as followers of God. The hope that he brings up here reflects that God would deliver them, of course. So this is this similar sort of idea, the hope of the Messiah would deliver them just like God had delivered them out of Egypt, and there's hope that would be, people would understand that. That's why we get the entire Exodus story to point to this right here, so people can have something to reflect back on. Oh, okay, God resurrected the Jewish people, brought them out of Egypt, saved them. Oh, okay, let's point to this Messiah and see that the same is going to happen here. So it shouldn't even be odd to these people that God would now be fulfilling the promise that he had given regarding the resurrection. So it shouldn't even be something like, oh, wait, we've never heard of this, because they had. It was in the scripture. It had been written about. If you go back to Isaiah and other prophets and other texts in the Bible, you will see, in the Old Testament specifically, you'll see pointing to this very moment. The Pharisees themselves would have no technical disagreement to what Paul is saying here, because they understand, or at least believe, that there is such a thing, or the ability of spirits and resurrection. So it would not be odd for them. It seems that they have not fully believed that God would do this. It's like they haven't fully grasped within their tiny little minds. I shouldn't say that. We all have tiny minds when it comes to this. God had now validated this belief that they already believed, that they already knew, by raising Jesus from the dead. The Messiah that had been promised to the Jewish people had been raised, and there he is. They're right there in front of him. As he is said in front of Felix and the Sanhedrin, that this is all hinged on the resurrection of hope, as in 25, if you go back to chapter 25, verse 19, one Jesus who is dead, but whom Paul claimed to be alive. This all hinges back to that as well. If they did not believe that God would raise the Messiah, or had in fact just did, why would they believe God would raise the dead at all? So that's another question that you could throw at this, is that then what's the purpose of this whole thing? And Paul makes that in some of his letters that he writes, is if it's not for what we believe in here, if it's not for this resurrection of the Messiah, then what's the point of all this? And he makes that clear here, but he also makes it clear in his other writings. All right, verses 9 and 11. We have here, whoops. Paul admits that he at one time, and so this is where he kind of takes a step back and provides kind of some past reflection of who he was, how he was like the other Pharisees and persecuted believers, just like he is being persecuted right now. Now these people, since he's a Roman citizen, can't kill him or put him to death or put him on trial at this point, especially now that he has appealed to Rome, but it's similar sort of what he used to do to people is now happening to him. Paul had been, of course, in these very shoes of those who had persecuted him. He could easily be on the other side of this trial. He had called those who believed in the risen Messiah as blasphemers and charlatans and people who were perverting the Jewish belief system, people who were causing division and angst and problems and chaos and anarchy, you name it, they were doing it, and he wanted to stop it. And that, to be honest, you always have to come from that perspective, is that though their hearts have been hardened to a lot of this, a lot of what is in the scripture, they're doing what they thought they needed to do to preserve the Jewish faith, because there had been others along the way who had truly been heretics, who truly had tried to bring in a new faith or try to obviously very much manipulate the Jewish faith, and so they always had to be wary of that. But Paul's trying to show them here that this is the real deal. This is something they need to believe in. He is similar to what the Jews, especially the high priests, are doing here, had taken people to trial and voted for the death penalty for their blasphemy. Exactly the same thing that he's dealing with. So you can look at the reflection of how he lived, how he acted, and now that same thing is happening to him. During that time, the ruling body of each synagogue constituted a minor law court. This is the time that I'm referring to, is when Paul was persecuting people. This really was not allowed by Roman law, but they at times would get away with being able to hold these court proceedings either in the synagogues. because you have to remember, only during this time could the Roman justice system actually call for the death penalty. Now, a synagogue is different from a temple. In the temple, and if it was in the temple, there was agreement between the Sanhedrin and the Romans dealing with the sanctity of the temple. And if the sanctity of the temple was injured in any way, the priest could execute capital punishment. But that was really the only time that they would be allowed to do that, which is probably good because they weren't very good at doing this sort of thing, obviously, especially based on their agenda. At this time, Paul is summarily saying that he was responsible for Stephen's death through his consent, as Stephen was tried by the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem back in chapter 8. The everyday Messianic followers should have not been as concerned as they were, not desecrating the temple in any way, but instead were just talking about an extension of the Jewish faith through the resurrection of the Jewish Messiah. The claim would not lead to capital punishment. So the idea was, we're not doing anything wrong in the temple. You can think of Stephen and others. There's no desecration of the temple in any way. Yet we have this going on. It's this capital punishment being forced upon people by those who do not have the ability or the right to force such a thing. Paul would say that, at least you could see or maybe possibly understand or decipher even from this, is that he did not want to kill those who were claiming the risen Messiah, but instead for them to actually turn away or give blasphemy to the Messiah and to turn away from their faith and to call Jesus accursed and to repudiate their claims. That was what Paul was really hoping for. I don't think he was ultimately hoping for death. But of course, if they didn't do that, then death would come. But that was not his original goal, it doesn't seem. At least that's what we've seen from some research on this. But unfortunately, the people would rather be killed for their beliefs than to back away from them. And that has continued to this day, where there are Christian martyrs because they're not willing to back away when terrorists or other people are trying to make them turn away from their faith. This is something that's pretty similar to what Pliny the Younger tried to do to get people to turn away from Christ. If they followed his command and cursed Christ, he would discharge them from whatever sentence they were under, whatever captivity they were under. As it was his belief that it would be impossible for people who are really Christians to be able to do this. So if they did that, they would not be Christians, and if they did, then they truly were. And so it's kind of his test to be able to do that. If you remember, Paul would chase people throughout the region into Gentile cities with synagogues, places where the Sanhedrin still had some power. They had some power to the synagogues, but for the most part, they were really kind of walking on thin ice when it came to the authority they were trying to execute. And we have to always keep that in mind, too, as we read through this. The thing to also keep in mind is that a lot of the Messianic Jews still practiced their faith, their prayers, their religion in the temple. And so the tension that they had to serve during that time was that they would still have to be amendable to the discipline of the synagogue. So if they were going to be in the synagogue, they still had to follow the rules. They still had to, and the traditions and how things played out, even though they believed in this Jewish Messiah. The rules of the synagogue were the rules of the synagogue, and they had to keep those in mind. So you have to remember that was always so happening and being taking place as well. Next week, we'll start with verse 12 here in chapter 26 and continue his story related to his trip to Damascus. And he's going to continue in a Gentile version of what happened, and that will run from verses 12 through verse 18. And then Paul will continue on this conversation with Agrippa through the rest of chapter 26. And then we'll probably jump into, depending on how crazy we want to get, to Paul's beginning journey to Rome there in chapter 27, may go through 1 through 13. And only have just a little bit of time left here in the book of Acts. I hope everyone has a great day. Thank you.